Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I am Brett Cooper, joined by Lita Hines from BlueFletch, and we're going to cover a topic around maximizing ROI for rugged Android devices, specifically in what we call the age of tariffs, which might be this week, might not be next week, who knows. Um, we're recording this at the beginning of Q2 2025, which has seen a bit of I guess economic haranguing, I guess is the right word. Is that how you describe it?
Yeah,
Where
definitely some hand wringing, some rending of garments for sure.
yeah, the U.S. government has decided to enact tariffs on other countries, rolled some of them back, has added some new ones, may roll those back, may add some new ones. Um, and what we've observed has been I guess, a stall in the rugged mobile device space. A lot of companies historically go through cycles where they're buying devices every couple of years or replacing devices. With the uncertainty around tariffs, for example, if you're buying a rugged mobile device that is normally $1,500 and they have 125% tariff on it, it's going to be can't do the math, but it's more than 1,500 bucks. So yeah, I think it raises it to substantially more than that. And then just coming out of that, Lee and I had some discussions over the last 2 weeks, and I think the comment he made was we've, yeah, as a company, BlueFletch has been through, I'd say, three or four difficult global economic macro struggles. So 2008, there's a lot of issues around the financial economy. I think 2017, there was a big set of tariffs. I can't remember who did that, but I remember it was around that time. And then, with COVID, there was issues with devices. And then following that, there were a lot of supply chain issues in 21, 22. So I think we've seen a lot of these. And really the notes we started to look at were what are the things that companies we work with over the last 18 years have done to help with either getting more value out of their current device set or extending the life of their current devices and really thinking about how do I maximize the ROI of my existing hardware in a time where I can't buy new hardware. So Lee, was that a good summary of what we had talked about and the origin for this webinar?
Yeah, I think so. And one other just small piece to that I would add is with the current environment, it's the uncertainty that is preventing people from being able to make a prediction that they can feel confident in. So that's where a lot of buying from a capital expenditure is going to just remain on hold until it's a little more clear what's going to happen next.
And the challenge this ends up, especially for IT and operations teams, is I have, as an operations manager at a large, let's call it retailer or manufacturer, I have thousands of people out on the floor using mobile devices, tablets, computers, and equipment, and they need to be able to do their jobs. So, their options are either, if a device breaks or if they don't have a device for that user, they can go back to pen and paper or workstation or just not be productive for that day. So it's a lot of how do we stay productive as an organization while we're dealing with a lot of this uncertainty. Before we hop into, Lee, maybe you could do the quick overview of what BlueFletch does and how that might be relevant. I know as we get into some of these ways we've seen people maximize ROI, but that would help give some framework for what we're talking about when we talk about BlueFletch.
Yeah, sure. So BlueFletch is a set of tools that's going to live on the shared Android devices for your frontline workers so that they can be as efficient as possible when performing their day-to-day tasks. So a typical interaction would be the user comes in at the beginning of his or her shift, picks a device up off the cradle, logs into that device, and is automatically signed in into all the applications that are appropriate for their role for that day. It's an intuitive process. It's one that doesn't really require much training. So it really allows the user to perform the tasks that they are supposed to be doing on that day, as opposed to struggling with a 14-digit password or something like that. It also really enables the company to understand who has a device and where it is and what applications are being used on it. So particularly in an environment where you have to make sure that your devices are being retained, but also you have to realize as much efficiency as possible because you might have expenses in other areas that you can't control that you do have to spend more on. if you can save money with your existing device fleet and make it that much more efficient, the BlueFletch tool set is going to help you do that.
Got it. Thank you. So I'll give a quick outline of what we're going to cover in the next half hour or so, and then we'll hop into some of these topics. So we'll start out with just a recap of the space, and I'm gonna call it the rugged AIDC mobile space, and then hop into some things we've learned around device accountability, device availability, loss prevention. Next, there's a couple pieces around device optimization for performance that we've seen in the last decade that companies have done. Also talking about optimizing the device lifespan, so making devices typically it will last a couple years, last longer. The shared device experience is something I know Lee's going to talk a bit about that. Support costs and operational costs for support, and then future proofing. So those will be the topics we'll cover as we go through them. And then one other note, we've just based on these notes, we've built out a white paper that will be available on the BlueFletch site. So if you want to download that, it's a bit more of a longer read, but some of the topics that we got into as we were jotting down our notes and reviewing our notes from the last few years of learnings. So I will we'll hop into the first, which is just the background and landscape.
Mhm.
But Lee, maybe you could talk a bit about, how we've gone from, 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of mobility and tools, and it was pen and paper and workstations to where we are now, and then some of the issues we faced in the last year, potentially up to 3 years.
Sure. So if you go back 10 years to Brett's point, there was still a lot of pen and paper out there and people still trying to determine if shared devices for frontline workers was even a viable model. I think there are still outliers that consider that question unanswered, but for the most part, the people that we're speaking with feel that operationally shared devices is something that's going to help their frontline workers perform the job. So that first question is answered. And then the question from there is, now that we're going to make this hardware purchase, how do we make these devices as usable as possible to improve operations? And what can we do to make the user experience more simplified? What can we do to make support costs as low as possible? How do we maintain and roll out these devices as quickly and efficiently as possible? So that's really where we are at this point. I think it's essentially understood in the market that shared devices really help with overall productivity. And so moving into that next phase, obviously with what we talked about from the current economic forecast, the cost of acquisition of hardware is going up. So if you already have mobile devices, you're actually in a good position because there are a lot of ways to increase the efficiency and increase the device life cycle from a warehouse, retail, and healthcare environment. Some of the pain points that IT operations are going to come into from managing mobile fleets is, and we'll get into it in more detail, is deployment of applications, understanding which applications are being used, which applications maybe are not being utilized at all, looking at OS upgrades on the device, when to make those, also battery considerations in terms of health of the device, because a lot can be done from a software perspective to actually make the device stay in the field and last longer. And there are a lot of obviously hidden costs within inefficient device management. There's lost productivity. On average, a user is spending about 11 hours a month just trying to figure out how to log on to their device or deal with other, I would call them IT support desk type issues. So that's, if at scale, that is a huge cost. So you're losing productivity there. And then also replacement cost from the perspective of if a device is put in a box and put on a truck and sent across the country, if you do that again across a network of DCs and these devices cost $1,500 to $2,000 a piece, that is going to add up very quickly. So what we're trying to do is really keep the devices where they're supposed to be, keep them in use, and keep how they're being used as efficient as possible.
That's a good segue into the first area of cost savings that you and I came up with, our first bucket of cost savings, which is device availability and loss prevention. And I actually used to call it like device loss. And then I had one of our clients is like, you should just call it device availability because that's what I need. I need these devices to be available to our to the folks in our stores and our warehouses. So I use that phrase moving forward. That was a couple of years back, but I appreciate that feedback from those guys. But maybe Lee, you can talk a bit about within device accountability and loss prevention. What are the things companies should be thinking about if they're not already doing them?
Sure. So just to frame out how big of an issue this is from a device loss or device accountability perspective, device availability perspective, typically we found on average around 15% of the devices that a customer might have year over year are no longer accounted for one reason or another. And our tools, generally speaking, and similar tools can cut this number in half. So if you had 15%, we can reliably get it down to between 7 and 8%. And the way that we're going to do that is really just increase accountability throughout the workday of a device. And I'll give some examples of that. So there's a term called check-in, check-out. And what that means is actually what happens during a shift when a user comes in. Actually, the first thing to do is check out that device. So check-in, check-out could be more sign in, sign out. So they pick up the device at the beginning of their shift. We can ensure that the device is logged into within a configurable period of time. Let's say it's 30 seconds after it's taken off the cradle. If that device isn't logged into, there's going to be an alarm that sounds, and at that point, the user can either log into the device or return to the cradle. So what you're doing is enabling the association between user and device as soon as the device is taken away from its dock. That way, you know who has that device, what applications they are logging into. The next step of that is device finding tools. So enabling you to find a device if it has not reported back, let's say in more than a shift, for example, or even in a shorter period of time, if you're really trying to know if the device is either in someone's hands or cradled. If it's not on either of those two situations, we can pull for that and you can find where those devices are, both on the device, on another device, and also from a portal. The second part of that is a lost device notification standpoint. So if a device hasn't reported in within a specific period of time, you can get notified of that. So then you go look for it. Because what we're trying to avoid is a device with a battery that maybe runs out and then is on top of a shelf in the back corner of the DC, never to be found again. We can also put tools in place from a device that either has a low battery, we can sound an alarm on that before the battery goes dead, or if a device hasn't moved in, let's say, 7 hours, it might be in a box next to the baler, and you probably want to move it out of the box that's going into the baler before the battery gets exploded. So there's a few different things you can do there just to really make sure that you know where these devices at any given point during the day.
Well, all I can think of is the scene from Star Wars where in the garbage compactor, I'm like, "That's your device."
Yeah, exactly. Brett and I actually talked to someone, we had never thought of this. They have 10 to 12 fires a year in their stores because their devices get stuck in balers and then compacted and the battery explodes. So a fire in your store is obviously a much bigger problem than a lost device, but it's just a knock-on effect of knowing where your devices are and how much efficiency and even safety and just operational uptime you can gain by just keeping track of these assets.
Can you talk about the cost side of that? Like, what does that look like? So you mentioned 15% loss. I imagine for a $1,000 or $2,000 device, that adds up pretty quick. But what's the savings you've seen or we've realized with companies we worked with?
Sure. So generally speaking, licenses for our software are going to be about $30 to $50 with the device finding included. So if you've got 10,000 devices out there, rather than buying 15% of those at $1,000 to $1,500 a piece, or just spending $30 to $50 per device to track that, you're going to get basically a 3x ROI instantly on spending on license costs versus device loss. So we've actually had customers come to us and say that our license is more than paid for themselves just by the fact that we were able to help them retain devices.
In the second piece of this, which I know you're probably going to talk about this, but the device availability, like the operational uptime, can you talk about how there's the paying for the device is also the employee productivity side?
Right, exactly. So, if you've got 50 employees at a site during a given shift and they all need devices for their tasks, but only 30 are available, then you're going to be in a position where you have to have the balance of the people without devices either trying to share with other people and get half of their work done, or maybe even revert to a pen and paper process. So we talked about really just implementing that smart sign in, sign out process at the beginning. So you make sure those devices are either in the hand of a user or on the cradle. That way, you're not checking out 50 at the beginning of the day and only getting 40 back at the end of the day, because that adds up very quickly in terms of what's going to happen to you from an operational efficiency loss perspective. So there's lots of ways to measure that as well, in terms of just looking at if this many devices were checked out at the beginning of the day. You can look at how often they are in use and signed in with a specific user throughout the course of the day. So you can start to look at device availability metrics and track those and measure those. And it gives you a lot of opportunities to really understand how the devices are being used and increase efficiency. So examples around that, I've mentioned our BlueFletch tooling. There are also several of the MDMs that are out there, like SOTI, AirWatch, 42 Gears are going to have tools that provide check-in, check-out as well. A lot of the OEMs will have tools like Zebra Device Finder, for example. And then there's even a further step in terms of locking cabinets and physical security around those devices. So either they are in the hand of a frontline worker or they're going to be locked up. Finally, I guess there's the most extreme example of device accountability where you're physically locking up the devices in lockers. Definitely definitely reduces your device loss, but it doesn't necessarily increase availability. If you don't give access to someone to unlock that, then it's just a it's just a piece of hardware in a box that's not usable. So you have to strike that happy medium from a security perspective and an operational efficiency perspective.
Yeah, you want people to use the devices, but you don't want them to lose the devices.
Exactly. And I think that goes into the next part of this is if you're using these devices as they're supposed to be optimized, then you have to start looking at device performance, device lifespan. If you're not able to purchase new hardware and you've already reduced your loss, how do you make these devices last even longer? I know, Brett, you've talked a lot about performance optimization and some of the things to consider.
Yep,
Um,
that's a
do you
good.
want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the good segue to next I'm going to call it bucket of areas to go save money, and performance optimization can mean a lot. I've as Lee and I were talking about this, I had a couple memories of projects over the last 10 years, and one of the biggest ones is we had a client that was um, they had a specific app where login was taking 3 or 4 minutes for the device to start up and log in. That was even with SSO, so that we'd provide SSO tokens into it. The app would start up and it'd take 3 minutes to get going. They assumed it was the SSO, and then when we looked at it, we found that it was improperly configured, was turned on, debug mode was turned on, so the device was loading, I think 400 or 500 files every time it loads. And with a little bit of analysis, identified how to get login down to 3 seconds. So definitely a big savings there. But I think the thing we looked at was when the app would start up, it went and consumed a bunch of resources on the device. It went and consumed a bunch of network calls, and that was making it slower. So it was using more resources on the device, battery, network, memory, and then B was just slower for the users, operationally slowing them down. So I think the idea there is like, can we start to go look at doing a performance audit of apps and app usage across our devices? So take a look at it. And person that Lee had mentioned earlier, there are tools out there. We have a support agent that we provide. There's tools from the MDMs. SOTI has Excite is great. B2M LMS, which is another tool for device monitoring, is good. Zebra and Honeywell both have tools that you can actually look at what's consuming CPU and memory on devices, and it's good to do an audit of that and try to understand how that maps up to what you're expecting. Um, some other things around that are just looking at what devices are used, or sorry, what applications are used on the device. So I know a lot of clients that I go work with will have what's called the GMS suite. So Google provides their full suite of apps. So if you take a generic Zebra or Honeywell device, it's going to have 20 or 25 Google apps installed on it, including things like their health app, their TV app, their Android Auto. And if this device is being used in a warehouse, that is a app that's running, consuming memory, consuming network that you're not actually using. So looking at what apps are actually on there are either installed or are set up to be active, and trim that down. I know with one client in particular, actually two clients in particular we've worked with, we got their daily network average usage for the devices down about 80% just by turning off specific GMS components and apps they weren't using. So it's something that'll save a lot on device performance, but also on the actual just network and infrastructure costs. Uh, and then another thing we look at around just general device health. And when I think of health, I think of the biggest indicator, and we use this for some of our dashboards. Biggest indicator is how often devices get rebooted. And there's a couple, just I call it like a sort of a trigger event of if you look at your fleet and you have what's called 5,000 devices, each device gets rebooted 20 times a day, you have something going on. So the users probably called the help desk one time. The help desk guy asked him to reboot his device. He did it, and now every single user reboots their device all the time. I remember one specific client we worked with. I went in there and in the morning, and the person was rebuilding every single device in the MDM. So at some point in time, they called the help desk. The help desk gave them a QR code to reinstall on one device. So that person in the store decided that every single day they were going to do that for all their devices. So the devices were unavailable for about 2 hours every morning while this one guy decided to rebuild them. But that type of visibility and looking into what's happening on your devices is something that can help you get a better picture of where to go, solve problems, and improve device availability. Um,
Yep.
and then
I had a phone call last week, or actually the week before, with a customer who had trained their teams just to pull the batteries out of all their devices every night.
what can go wrong?
And so I was like, I get you're trying to solve some things, but there are other ways to solve those same problems. So
I was thinking about your previous comment on putting devices into locked cabinets. I had a client that was pulling the batteries, putting the device into locked cabinets, and they couldn't understand why their application updates never got deployed to the devices.
exactly. Yeah.
It turns out the MDM couldn't talk to the device for 14 hours a day.
Yeah.
The batteries are interesting, but that's another area around device performance that if you really look at it, the battery has material implications on what's happening. Batteries do degrade over time. Applications can be overly consumptive of batteries. And this goes back to that tooling. Do you know the average shift cycle for your battery? So if your OEM, to Zebra Honeywell, says this battery should last 14 hours on a shift, does it actually last that long? So for us, there's back to a lot of those tools. You can use those to look at how long your battery's going during a shift, how often they're being replaced. Sometimes it's batteries that need to be swapped out. So the battery has been charged 800 times, no longer has a good memory and needs to be pulled from the fleet and replaced. Um, that's something we've done with clients where go look and build a list of, across the 10,000 batteries that are used in our fleet, which ones need to be replaced at what sites, and used our data to build a report and send that out. And they went and had somebody at the site go pull all those batteries, and they swapped them out with the help desk. And that made the experience of the end users in those stores was a lot less frustrating because they'd never pick up a device that would run out of battery in 2 hours, which is important for them. Also on the battery side, one of the things we found is there's certain apps that are, I'm going to call them offenders. They're highly consumptive of the batteries, and it's either through I've seen apps that have poorly written location services. So GPS used to be a big offender because it
Mhm.
uses the radios and certain aspects of the device. Other ones like excessive network calls. If the device is making network calls when it doesn't need to be, that'll increase the consumption of the battery. And then also settings like the screen time. So how long do you have adaptive brightness? Do you have your screen going to sleep after 4 minutes or 3 minutes of unuse versus 20 minutes? And then other pieces we see really around the battery are, are people putting it back into the cradle at the end of shifts, back to Lee's point, if they just set the device down by where the cradles are, it's not going to charge. So I think that's another one. And then even on the cost savings, if you start to look at it, if a site says they need more devices, do they need more devices, or could it be you could just provide them with some spare batteries, and that would allow them to swap batteries mid-shift and not have a device come offline for charging, which is, I know we always talk about iOS being the battery is one of the biggest disadvantages there. It's if you can't swap the battery and you're in the middle of a shift, you're going to have to go get a new device, which is operationally creates a lot of overhead for those employees.
A lot of overhead, and especially if you're running scant on devices, like if you've got 10 devices for 10 users, and then they're going to be down at that point. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
No, tooling wise, I mentioned the tooling, but BlueFletch has some tooling around this. We have build reports. The other tools that are out there, monitoring B2M's got a good tool. Splunk used to have a good tool called Mint. They got rid of it. Zebra's got Visibility IQ. Honeywell has their Insight apps or their visibility apps. And then on the MDM side, SODI has Xsight. Intune doesn't have anything good I've seen. I think it's mainly snapshots, so it's not a good set of historical data. You can pull some data out of Workspace ONE, but I would say SODI's probably got a better offering from the tooling. And I don't know, Lee, is there anything else tooling wise you've seen out there?
I think you covered it. I think the key with these tools is just to set them up and make sure that you have a procedure and protocol in place to regularly monitor them. It's actually not that much overhead to get those up and running. And then if you just put it as part of the workflow for whoever is managing your devices, be it at a centralized level or even at a per site level, if you have people looking at that, it really does increase device retention and availability, but also just understanding the device health. I think you have to make it a habit to look at those things.
It's like your personal health. Go step on the scale once a month, see where you're at.
Exactly.
It's
But
always
then think about it.
it's a good segue. On the shared device side, I know that was another big bucket Lee
Mhm.
talked about was shared device and role-based devices. Do you want to talk a bit about some of the learnings there, potentially some ways people can save money with moving to more of a role-based model?
Sure. So the way the BlueFletch tooling is designed to have role-specific experiences on a device, regardless of what device it is. Anyone can pick it up, and based on their credentials that are entered, they will get an experience on that device that's specific to their role and perhaps the tasks that they need to be performing throughout the course of their shift. So from an efficiency perspective, what that's going to allow you to do is you don't have to have a set of devices for just receiving, a set of devices for everyone that's doing picking, a set of devices for everyone that's at a managerial level. You can have a common pool that anyone can use a device and get the experience that's appropriate for them. So what that's going to do is allow you to share devices across shifts and throughout a facility. You don't have to have a device that's always in one specific area. The device is going to work anywhere based on what the user is trying to do. So you can also use the shared device mode to deliver custom home screens, different apps that the users are going to be able to see, and also settings. Like someone in one role may not need to get to a specific set of lockdown settings, whereas someone else may need to get to that because they need to do something a little bit more advanced. And because this experiences are tailored, you're going to have to spend less money on the training. So the idea is you pick up this device when you walk in the door, your credentials are entered, and that experience is going to be what you're expecting based on what your role is and what your tasks are. So you don't have to hunt through a bunch of applications that aren't appropriate for you just to find the two that you interact with on a regular basis. And also the look and feel of the device is going to be one that is pretty parallel to what you might see on a consumer Android device. Most people are familiar with how to use a smartphone. They probably are on smartphones most of the time they're outside of work. So they understand the functionality and what to do. And it's just kind of inherent that you can transfer that over to a shared device. So you can really cut down on training costs as well. Um, you can also measure productivity improvement from this perspective. So if you look at, you could say, for example, if you look at average picks per shift from workers, you can take that pre and post shared device being available and see exactly how much an improvement there is. So it allows you another way to point back to return on investment so that if you're trying to prove this cost out as something that's efficient for your organization, if you have stakeholders that are asking you for that, you have that ability.
And
Um,
I know we didn't. I think this is something that we alluded to earlier on, but like the SSO components, I feel like that is something we provide, but cost savings for SSO was not really something we articulated in the white paper. But Lee can maybe talk a bit about what people see with, pick up a device as a manager, I log in, I get single sign-on. What are the savings we see around that, or what are the benefits around improved login experience?
Sure. So I think I might have mentioned earlier, there are issues. People on devices spend about 11 hours a month just dealing with issues. But from a single sign-on perspective, specifically, all of the applications are installed on the device all the time. So once my credentials are entered, I'm only going to see the applications that are appropriate for my role. Nothing needs to be pulled down and installed. Um, that way, just the speed of getting up and working is going to be essentially immediate at that point. So I think that really can add quite a bit. Also, we can trigger things like when you scan a barcode, depending on the barcode format, we can open an application that that barcode is associated with. So if you're doing a cycle count, that automatically will launch that app for you. So we can really tie it back directly to productivity from a single sign-on perspective. I think that's a big part of it. So if you look at, the amount of bandwidth that a user can put through in terms of work that's produced, there's really no hiccups on the front and back end of that from a single sign-on perspective and getting access to the tools they need to perform their job.
And you said 11 hours a month was the average. I think we've seen for login time prior to using BlueFletch. And if you put $15 an hour, I'm going to call it $165 a month. What is the cost savings that people can get out of a tool like a BlueFletch or some of the other SSO tools that are out there?
Sure. So it's probably going to be around $1,500 a device a year. So if you've got 5,000 devices, that's a significant savings, right? And in the grand scheme of things, little improvements like that across the board, be it in increased productivity, in increased device retention and availability, and the ability to understand on the device how you can optimize the device usage itself from a tooling perspective, you're going to lower costs across the board. And these numbers of 50,000, 75,000, $120,000, while in a budget at large, that may not seem like a lot, but when you add 7 or 8 of those together, it gets to be a pretty significant cost savings.
Yeah, especially when you can't afford to buy new devices.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The tooling wise, you mentioned, you talk about BlueFletch has those capabilities. Are there other tools we've seen a lot of usage for that shared device experience and single sign-on experience?
Absolutely. Intune has their Microsoft Shared Device Mode, and the MDMs that you're going to see, the most common ones like SODI, Workspace ONE, and 42 Gears, are also going to have support for Shared Device Mode. Um, I touched on it earlier, but there seems to be a general acknowledgement now that you need to have devices available for your workforce. And then as long as you're purchasing these devices, you might as well share them because you can get operational efficiency and cost efficiency from that perspective. So the tooling is really geared towards that model and that mindset. And I think it's been a fun shift to watch the realization, and then the level of sophistication of questions that we get are a little bit farther down the road than maybe they were, like, say, 4 or 5 years ago.
Got it. Um, I think for the next topic, which is just general cost optimization strategies, I could talk about a couple of these, but
Okay.
it dovetails well on that. The first one we've seen, these are more general cost optimization strategies. The first one is I can't remember. I think actually I do remember who it is. This is somebody we worked with a couple years back. He called it the Robin Hood strategy, which is you take devices from DCs or stores or warehouses that are not using them, and then reallocate them to the ones that are using the majority of their devices. And I was like, Robin Hood. He's like, yeah, steal from the rich, give to the poor. And I'm like, I get it. But the process they went through is they actually looked at across their sites, what sites used all of their devices every day, what sites use 75% of their devices, what sites use 50%, built a report, sent that to the operations team, and actually built a spreadsheet and reallocated. They said, this pull 5 devices from this site, reallocate to this other one. And that it was weird. It did have a material improvement on their operational efficiencies. And I think this goes back to one of the studies that we read as we were researching this, which was I think with using pen and paper instead of a mobile device for activity in a warehouse can be 40 to 70% savings efficiency to actually have the mobile device, just not having to write things down or double enter things. So the Robinhood strategy is a potential avenue to look at. The
Mhm.
next one who I've seen was actually looking at your software licensing. And I used to do auditing 20 or 30 years ago, and I remember the thing that was always interesting is when we audited data centers, if they had 200 licenses, 300 licenses for Microsoft server, but they only had 180 servers installed. It was a super quick cost savings. And this is a similar model of if you have 7,000 licenses for your let's call it your green screen application, whether it be Stay Linked or Velocity, and you're only using 5,000 devices. How do you not renew on those and save that price differential? But it really goes back to starting. You have to have visibility into what what devices are used, how many are used during the shifts, what's in production. And then another activity I've seen customers do around this is specifically around homegrown. I had one customer that had 20 or 30 homegrown apps, and the head of IT said, "What apps are we using the most, and what apps are we not using?" So we actually went and did analysis for across 40, 50,000 devices and said, "Here's the usage. These apps are at the bottom," and I think there was 3 apps that were only used in 2 or 3 stores of a 1,000 store customer, and like they looked at it and said, we're not buying this. We're not going to invest any more money in it. And they pulled those out, and there was 3 guys that were angry, I think, but they
The
saved
three users.
they saved a incredible amount of money by not having to pay those licenses. So it's you're doing a running a software audit across what's used versus not used can measurably save a lot of capital and OpEx. And then
Yep.
the last one around cost optimization that we called out as we were looking through our notes was around network spend. And this is, I guess there's 2 sides of network spend. The first is, how much network bandwidth are my devices in a facility using? And this is if I look at it, we did an audit for a company last year. And like I said, we got turned off a bunch of GMS apps, turned off a bunch of features that were not used, and have done that a couple times for different clients. And the one client cut their network usage from the store by 80% for the devices. So there's 2 effects there. One is the I guess they're already paying for the network, but they're saving a lot of performance on that. And if you were paying by consumption of network, you actually will save money there. That becomes even more useful if you have cellular devices. So a lot of devices are out in the field in trucks, warehouses, remote nurses, healthcare systems will do a lot of remote healthcare now operations now. If you look at those devices, your cellular usage may be consumed by a lot of apps you are not even using. And this goes
Right.
back to my GMS example. So Google gladly puts all their apps on a lot of these devices, and they will gladly consume a lot of network if you're not paying attention. But there are other apps too that are a little greedy with the network, and it's always useful to look at, can you identify what it is first, and then optimize your network costs. And with cellular, you can definitely save a lot of money really quickly by doing a quick audit of that.
Yeah, and I think the role-based side of this too also plays into it. Because if you don't have roles, you may have 3 dozen applications on the device at all times, but based on your role, you may only use 10% of those. So you can keep the bandwidth usage down by not using applications that are not going to be used by that role. So I think that can be helpful too.
I think a good example we've seen across a number of clients is um, around telephony. So for telephony, you pay for a extension on your PBX or your voice server, and historically, a lot of these companies would have to have an extension for every single mobile device. We've had some customers that'll take BlueFletch and say, "I only want my managers to have VoIP." And so what happens is when you log in, we make a request, it pulls the extension down, assigns it to that device at that point in time. So instead of having to pay for 30 extensions for a store, you're just paying for the manager, assistant manager, or the MOD, and it cuts your telecom expenses from 30 licenses down to 4 or 5.
Hmm. Yeah, and of course, again, at scale, if you have 2,000 stores, that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Last bucket, or sorry, the second to last bucket was around what we call reducing no faults and reducing your support costs. So that there's a couple areas here. The first one is that a device typically in a store or warehouse or hospital, if it breaks, it'll get put in a box, sent back to a repair facility. Sometimes it's a reseller, sometimes it's a manufacturer, sometimes it's a repair center that's owned by that organization. And what happens is they'll take the device out, try to figure out what's wrong with it, fix it. If it's a broken screen, they'll replace that. If there's a software issue, they'll try to fix it, rebuild it, and then put it back in the box and ship that back to that site or another site. Normally, this is done through Spare Pool, and Spare Pool is I maintain 10% of my fleet on hand. I advance swap a device or I send them a device right away, and then they send me the one in the box back that's broken. So that's the typical process there. And what we found is a lot of devices get sent back that actually don't have a fault, and it's called no fault found. And
Mhm.
look at it and be like, don't know what happened. It's not a hardware issue. Maybe something was wrong with the software at that point in time, but the uh, the person trying to fix it is unable to identify. And there's a couple downsides from a cost perspective. You're spending the shipping both ways, which used to be less expensive. Now it's gotten up to, I think like a shipping device last week and it was like $40 compared to a couple of years back when it was like 15. But if you ship a device both ways, it could be 20, 40, $80 of cost, and then having a technician look at it can get really expensive. So the piece around there to think at is, do you have remote support tools where your help desk can remotely look at a device, can go proactively do maintenance on devices, and ensure the devices are in good condition? And a lot of this goes back to what Lee said earlier. Do you have a process where, once a month, one of your remote support techs, if they're not doing anything, will go do a pass of a store or a region and verify all the devices are in good operation condition. So that's sort of that preemptive looking at how do I not have to ship devices back, and then there's a lot of costs associated with the help desk call, initial help desk call from the user, the swaps, the service tech, and then also just the device being offline. So there's a lot of costs associated with support that, if you can eliminate no fault founds or cut those, it'll definitely help with cost savings. And then, I think the last category, Lee, we talked about was the future proofing items, and maybe you can talk a little about it. And one of the ones that was a little bit controversial when we discussed it was BYODs. It's actually looking at BYOD. If you can't purchase devices, can you get employees to provide them? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with someone last week who is in the midst of this exact consideration with BYOD versus having shared devices available when the employees come to work. So BYOD definitely saves money, but where you're going to run into limitations is standardization of the device. So that if you even are able to have one platform, for example, just Android, which wouldn't necessarily be that easy to enforce. You have to maintain minimum OSs. You also are going to have to deal with, if you choose to enroll those devices in your MDM, doing partitions for the work side of the device. It can feel a little bit invasive to the customer, to your associates, to have their device quote unquote monitored, even though they own it. And you just may run into situations where it's a little bit harder to keep control of those things. Definitely cheaper on the front end, but you're going to be making up some of that savings in the wrong way with the amount of overhead and administration that is going to be needed for essentially ensuring that the devices your employees are bringing in the door are going to be in a position to actually help them perform better. Brett, I know we talked about some of the security considerations around this, but also from like a tooling perspective, what are some of the things you've seen?
I think of the biggest use case I see for this is the the example where a store manager or somebody in the leadership team has their personal device and you use the MDM to create a container. So both Android and iOS have, through the MDMs, have the, like as you articulated, a containerized model where this container has effectively all of your employee apps, and you can only get to it when you're geofenced at a site or you log in, and those apps are partitioned or sandboxed from everything else on your device. So it helps reduce the security overlap.
Mhm.
But I think looking at what you're paying for on your MDM side, you already have some of these capabilities. Can you, especially for managers or W-2 employees, can you provide them with that capability for their personal carry devices? But I feel like the users on the floor, the standardization really becomes a problem. I know Walmart purchased a lot of Xcover Pros and deployed those to users, and I feel like that was very well received by the end users, but there was also a lot of support and maintenance and repairs that went along with that when they deployed 300,000 devices or whatever it was across their workforce. And I think the one upside there is they did deploy the same device to everybody, so it's a lot easier to manage your app landscape for that type of rollout.
Yeah, that's the COPE model. This is the BYOD, is bring your own COPE. COEE is company owned, it, but
Personally, yeah.
personally enabled. Yeah, exactly. So that's a yet another model, and I think it's, you really have to look at what your overall goals are, and I think there's always room around the fringes for a BYOD or a COPE for certain roles, but at large, I think shared devices is probably going to be the most standardized and efficient way.
Yep. Another bucket we talked about was just extending your device lifespan. So typically, we've seen in the past companies will replace rugged devices every 3 to 5 years. The consumer devices are 1 to 3 years is sort of the timeline for replacement. So the thing that we've seen some companies do is think about, and this requires a little bit of planning. It might be too late for some organizations, but look at, if you buy a device, are you buying top of the line that's going to have a CPU that can support the next X versions of the OS? So I know on the iOS side, they're pretty good about doing 5 or 6 versions of support for older devices. Android, it really depends on the chipset. I know Zebra does a good job with their Lifeguard. I think they do 5-year roadmap or five OS upgrades is really the target there. Honeywell does a good job with it as well. So it's having that visibility into, when I buy hardware, is it going to have forward support? And the reason this becomes important is there are certain application packages, and I'm gonna probably blow this, but I'm gonna pick a WorkJam. I know WorkJam has support for, I think, Android 9 and above. And so if you have a device that's on Android 7 and you can't upgrade it, you're sort of stuck. You can't use the newer version of their APKs. But at the same time, if you have a device that supports forward-looking versions, can you upgrade your fleet from, let's call it Android 9 to Android 11 to get support from your vendors that are providing your applications for you? So that's a piece there, is really thinking about your device lifespan. Other things about the device lifespan I think about are just looking at, do you have a repair contract? Some of the resellers we work with do a really good job of, you have a device that's got a cracked screen, you send it in, they'll put it on a contract and repair it for you. So you can have annual contracts, and some of the resellers, and I know like Stratix, TRG, come to mind. I've seen them do really good jobs around like extending the lifespans of devices by having the ability to just do repairs and swaps and build that capability in house. So that's
Mhm.
another way. And then I think the on the OS piece, this is a debate that I've had in the past. We've had, I think, some podcasts about it, but for OS is like, if you're on an OS and it's stable and you don't need to upgrade, you don't need to upgrade. So just like, security patches are important, doing security audits are important, but don't upgrade just for the sake of upgrading, because sometimes when you upgrade to a newer version, it will consume more resources and capabilities, and then you're stuck with a device that you upgraded and made slower for no reason.
Mhm.
Side of that is like, when you look at upgrading, are there things you can go and configure to improve the performance, optimize performance on those devices? So things I think of are, like animations. A lot of the newer versions of Android added in like, it's animate and it does this thing, and your guy in the warehouse doesn't care that it looks pretty. All he cares about is he gets to the next screen as quickly as possible. So are there things you can turn off for animations? Are there features and functionality you can turn off? Back to the earlier point on apps, can you turn off apps that are not used, that you don't need? And that allows your device to have more memory available, more CPU available for, be able to use it longer, as opposed to having to go buy the latest and greatest, which you may not be able to based on the current pricing in the market. So that's
Exactly.
anything else with future proofing, Lee, you can think of, or future forward strategies?
Um, I think I think you covered it. I think the key part is, if you haven't already started thinking about some of these things, it's obviously tough to go backwards and look at um, things that you could have anticipated that were unanticipatable. But I think there's definitely room to look at the OS upgrade strategies that Brett just mentioned. Also, if you don't have a refurbish or repurposing support contract with your reseller, reach out to them on that, because they are in a similar boat to you in that their cost for this hardware is going up as well. So they're going to be looking for other ways to maintain their revenue streams if they aren't selling as much hardware. So you probably could get a pretty good opportunity to strike a deal on a support contract if you don't already have one, would be my thought on that. That's what I would do. That's how I would reach out.
Yeah, it's a good engagement opportunity for save costs for you and for them.
Yep.
Just summary and recap a couple of these key points we walked through. So we talked about device accountability, loss prevention. So how do you track your devices? Don't lose as many of them. Optimizing device performance. So how do you make devices perform faster? Be able to have employees do more with the same hardware. Optimizing the device lifespan. So I think what we just talked about, having them last longer, being able to keep a device for 6 years instead of 5. The shared device experience, which is, there's a lot of tools out there. It may be a little bit heavier lift to be able to go and change some of those operational processes, but it's might be able to give you what you're looking for without having to buy new hardware. Reducing the support costs, so you figure out how to spend less money with things like the no fault founds, help desk support, and then the future proofing your fleets. Just really thinking through, how do you take what you have and use it longer. Start that journey now. So those are the key areas we covered. As I mentioned, we will be putting out a white paper that's got a in-depth into a lot of these items. If you do have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to hop on the phone. Lee, did I miss any key points or things that we've been talking about, and how companies can save money?
I don't think we missed out on it, but one thing I want to just drive home is the cumulative impact of all of these things, where, if you're doing marginal gains across the board in anywhere from 5 to 10 different areas, that's really going to add up from a cost savings perspective. But then also you're going to realize, I believe, a multiplier from an increased efficiency perspective as well. If you have employees that are happier with how those devices are being used, they're not spending as much time being frustrated with something not working, then their productivity is going to increase as well. So there are some unseen savings that you will start to be able to realize over time, just based on the cumulative effect of all the things we've talked about.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Appreciate your time. And if you do have follow-up questions, you can reach out to us at info@bluefletch.com or visit us on the site at bluefletch.com. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.